The cellar is colder than the rest of the building. The air carries pitch, dry oak, and underneath both, something earthier, saltpetre under a layer of coal. One man stands beside a stack of firewood, holding an iron object the size of a kitchen jug. It has a hinged door. Inside, a candle is burning. The candle cannot be seen. That last detail is the only one that matters. The lantern in his hand is built around a rotating cylinder of sheet iron. When the cylinder turns, the candle's light is sealed off, completely, instantly. He can stand in absolute dark with a flame 2 inches from his fingers, and no one outside the cellar will know he is there. The instrument is called a dark lantern. It exists for one reason: to make light invisible. He carries other things: a pocket watch, slow matches, touchwood, boots and spurs ready for a fast horse. He gives his name as John Johnson. It is not his name. It is 11:30 on the night of the 4th of November, 1605. Footsteps come down the stairs. The men coming for him have been down here once already this evening. Quietly, casually, without an arrest. They have come back because the King's government was not merely trying to find the man in the cellar. It was trying to close the trap at exactly the right moment. The lantern would survive. The hand that carried it would not. What follows is not the story of a plot that failed. It is the story of what the failure built, and what it is still building every November. Most retellings of this night begin with a bearded soldier and end with a bonfire. They are not wrong. They are incomplete. The man in the cellar was not the leader. His name was not John Johnson, and the object in his hand was not merely evidence. It was the reason he could wait in the dark, with a living flame 2 inches from his fingers, while the state waited for the conspiracy to reveal itself completely. The leader was riding north from London at that hour with most of his cousins. He was a Warwickshire landowner named Robert Catesby. The 13 men around him were not strangers recruited for a cause. They were brothers, cousins, in-laws, a private Catholic network bound by blood, marriage, debt, and revenge. In Catesby's family, treason was not an abstraction, it was a remembered fact. Another Catesby had served Richard III and was executed 3 days after Bosworth. So 3 things to keep in mind, because all 3 grow worse the longer you look at them. First, how a network of provincial Catholic gentry rented a basement directly beneath the upper chamber of Parliament, through ordinary civil contracts, and moved roughly 1.5 tons of black powder into it without a single official noticing. Second, what is on 3 pieces of paper still kept at the National Archives. 3 signatures, the same hand, 9 days apart, and each one says something different about how much pain a man can take before his name changes shape. Third, what happened to the building afterwards, because something happened to it. 420 years later, the night is still commemorated, and every November, the cellars are still searched. The plot did not begin with powder, it began with paperwork. This is the first strange fact. They did not break into Parliament, they rented it. In March of 1605, a property in central Westminster was leased through the standard chain, owner, subletter, tenant, that any Jacobean Londoner would recognise. The tenant was Thomas Percy, a gentleman pensioner of the King, one of 50 mounted bodyguards with the formal right of approach to His Majesty's person. He explained that he needed lodgings convenient to court. The property he wanted was a ground-level vault directly beneath the upper chamber of Parliament, the chamber in which, in 7 months' time, James I would open the legislative session in the presence of his wife, his eldest son, the bishops, the senior judges, and every peer of the realm. Percy took the lease in his own name. He paid the rent. The transaction passed through without remark. As historian Mark Nichols has argued, the Jacobean state did not yet treat Parliament as a target, or its cellars as a security problem. In May, they began moving the powder. 20 barrels at first rowed up the Thames after dark and stored in a house Catesby had taken in Lambeth. 16 more arrived in July. Gunpowder was, in theory, a royal monopoly, but in practice, with money and a quiet warehouse, it could be bought. By late summer, all 36 barrels lay beneath the Lords, hidden under coal and firewood. The opening of Parliament was then postponed once more, this time for plague, to November 5th. Fawkes inspected the cache in late August and found some of it degraded. He brought fresh barrels to replace the worst. The Tower's later inventory of the seized powder describes 1800 weight as decayed. Whether the full cache, if lit, would have produced a weak fizz or destroyed everything from the Lords to Westminster Abbey is one of the questions historians still cannot agree on. A reconstruction, filmed in 2005, using deliberately degraded powder, confined in similar barrels, demolished a concrete test chamber. Antonia Fraser treats the question as open. What is not open is what they intended. On the evening of October 26, 1605, a Catholic peer, Lord Monteagle, was sitting down to supper at his house in Hoxton, just north of London. A footman brought him a letter that had been pressed into his hand on the street by an unknown messenger. It was unsigned. It was written in a disguised hand. It contained about 160 words. Monteagle had it read aloud at the table. One sentence stopped him. "They shall receive a terrible blow this Parliament, and yet they shall not see who hurts them." He went to Whitehall that night. He gave the letter to Robert Cecil, the King's principal secretary. Cecil read it. Cecil thanked him. Cecil did nothing for 9 days. The letter is still kept at the National Archives in Kew, under the reference SP 14/216/2. The most likely author, in the view of Mark Nichols and Antonia Fraser, is Francis Tresham, Monteagle's own brother-in-law, the last man recruited into Catesby's network, and the one with most reason to want his sister's husband out of the chamber. But it cannot be proven. Some have argued that Monteagle himself wrote it, to give himself a public alibi for what he already privately knew. None of the readings can be confirmed. The handwriting refuses to give up its hand. The conspiracy did not yet know it had been pierced. 9 days, and for 8 of them the government waited. You would expect the response of a state minister faced with a written warning of regicide to be immediate. The records show something else. Cecil received the letter on the night of October 26th. The state opening was scheduled for November 5th. He had 9 days. He used 8 of them. October 27th, nothing. October 28th, nothing. The week passes. On the afternoon of November 4th, Cecil finally moved. The Lord Chamberlain descended into the cellars beneath the chamber, accompanied by Monteagle himself. They walked through the vault Percy had leased. They saw the firewood. They saw a tall man in a cloak who explained that he was John Johnson, servant to Mr. Percy. They commented on the unusual quantity of fuel for a private storeroom. They left without an arrest. The casual visit was not casual. It was the first half of a 2-stage protocol. Confirm the cache, identify the operator, leave the operator in place. At 11:15 that night, Sir Thomas Knivet, Justice of the Peace for Westminster, came back with a small armed party. The man was still there. So were the boots, so were the spurs, so was the lantern. Knivet's men opened the firewood. Underneath, in 36 barrels, lay roughly 1.5 tons of black powder. He was carrying slow matches, touchwood, and a pocket watch. These were not the tools of a servant guarding firewood. They were the kit of a man planning to light a fuse and run. A horse was waiting at Lambeth. He was taken to the Tower of London before dawn. The lantern went with him as evidence. It would never come back. This is where every retelling of the plot pivots, to the interrogation, the confession, the names. But the records suggest a different pivot, and it is not in the Tower at all. It is in Cecil's office. Until now, this looked like a story about a Catholic conspiracy that almost succeeded. The records show it was about something else. It was about a state apparatus that had been preparing anti-Catholic legislation for over a year, that had not yet found a political moment violent enough to pass it, and that suddenly, on the morning of November 5th, 1605, had its moment. Pauline Croft, who wrote the modern biography of Cecil, has shown that drafts of the legislation that would become the Popish Recusants Act and the Oath of Allegiance were already circulating in Cecil's papers in early 1605. They had not been brought to Parliament because Parliament would not have passed them. The mood was wrong. The country had no appetite for another round of Elizabethan recusancy fines. By November 6th, the mood had changed. Cecil did not invent the plot. The conspirators were real. The powder was real. Catesby's network was real. But Cecil understood, by mid-October, what the plot could become if it were allowed to mature. Not just a crime, but a mandate. The lantern in Knivett's hand was not just the moment of capture, it was the moment a piece of legislation became inevitable. The powder failed. The politics did not. The first strange fact lived in property records. The second lives in handwriting. In the Tower, on November 6th, the King sent an order to the Lieutenant of the Tower, Sir William Ward. The order specified, in James I's own handwriting, "The gentler tortures are to be the first used unto him, et sic per gradus adim attenditur, and so by degrees to the lowest. God speed your good work." 3 confessions survive in what is known at Kew as the Bag of Secrets. In Series SP 14/216, they are signed by the same hand on 3 different days. The first, dated November 8th, names no one but himself. The signature is steady, Guido Fawkes. The second, dated November 9th, names everyone. The handwriting on the body of the document is normal. The signature is not. The name Guido begins, falters at the middle stroke, and trails off into an unreadable mark. There is no surname. The third, dated November 17th, signs cleanly, Guido Fawkes. Underneath the cleanness is something more difficult to read. A man who has been broken once, and has chosen to write his name properly the next time. You can examine these 3 sheets, side by side, in the search room at Kew. The legal records specialist who curates them, Daniel Gosling, has called the November 9th signature mute witness to the agonies he must have suffered. It is, but it is also a document of competence. The same hand that could not finish its own name on November 9th chose to finish it cleanly on November 17th, and to name his cousins doing it. While Fawkes was in the Tower, the rest of the network rode northwest, hoping to gather a Catholic uprising that never came. By November 7th, they were at Holbeche House, on the border of Staffordshire, soaked and exhausted. What happened there is recorded in Mark Nicholls' account. They had brought their remaining gunpowder, wet from a river crossing, and laid it out before the dining room fire to dry. A spark caught it. Catesby was burned. Several others were injured. The men who had planned to ignite 3,000 pounds of powder beneath a chamber of their enemies had been burned by their own powder, drying before a country fire. The local sheriff arrived the next morning with 200 men. Catesby and Thomas Percy stood together in the courtyard and were struck, both of them, by a single musket ball. According to a Jesuit chronicler who knew the family, Catesby crawled back into the house and died holding an image of the Virgin Mary. The bullet holes from that morning are still visible in the front wall of Holbeche House. It is Grade 2 star listed in King's Winford. Anyone can drive past it. The 8 survivors were tried in Westminster Hall on January 27, 1606, inside the same building they had tried to destroy. They were sentenced under the law of treason. 4 were executed on January 30th in St Paul's churchyard. The remaining 4, including Fawkes on January 31st, in Old Palace Yard, opposite the chamber they had failed to bring down. Fawkes climbed the ladder last. Weakened by nearly 3 months in the tower, he had to be helped up. At the top he jumped. The fall broke his neck. It was the last competent act of his career. That should have been the end of it. The plotters were dead. The cellar had been swept. The lantern had been taken. The country had been told, in pamphlets and sermons, that the king's life had been saved by divine providence. It was not the end. It was the beginning of the part of the plot that actually worked. The first machinery the failure built was legal. In the summer of 1606, Cecil's drafted legislation arrived in Parliament. Before the plot, anti-Catholic laws were politically difficult. After the plot, they were almost impossible to oppose. The Popish Recusants Act fined any Catholic who refused to attend Anglican services £60 or 2/3 of his lands, and allowed magistrates to enter Catholic homes without warrant. The Oath of Allegiance, passed that June, required every Catholic in England to swear publicly that the Pope had no authority to depose the King. Pope Paul V condemned the oath 3 months later. Catholics who took it were excommunicated. Catholics who refused were guilty of high treason. This legal architecture remained in place, in successive forms, for 224 years. Catholic emancipation came in 1829, longer than the entire history of the United States to date. The conspirators, in trying to end the persecution of English Catholics, had built the statutory machinery that would persecute them for 2 more centuries. Statute was one machinery. The stage was another. In the spring of 1606, while drafting Macbeth, Shakespeare inserted into the second act a porter who joked about a Jesuit on trial. The Jesuit was Henry Garnet, head of the English Jesuit mission, executed at St Paul's on May 3rd, 1606. Garnet had heard the plot under the seal of confession and refused to break it. The state did not accept that defence. The porter scene names him in his own theological term. Faith hears an equivocator that could swear in both the scales against either scale, who committed treason enough for God's sake, yet could not equivocate to heaven. A man executed in May, a play that named him within the year. Catholicism, in the English imagination, became inseparable from treason. The association lasted as long as the legislation. Parliament had received its terrible blow, just not from gunpowder. And the third strange fact, what Parliament did with the memory of what it survived. In January 1606, before the trials had finished, Parliament passed the Observance of 5th November Act. It required that the date be marked every year in every parish in England with prayers, sermons, and bonfires of thanks for the deliverance of the King. The Act remained on the statute book for 253 years. Long after it was repealed, in 1859, the bonfires continued. They continue this November. In 1608, Sir William Waugh, who had supervised Fawkes' interrogation, commissioned a marble plaque listing the conspirators, set into the wall of the council chamber at the Queen's House. It is the oldest permanent monument to the plot. It is still there. The cellar itself burned down in October 1834, when fire destroyed most of the medieval Palace of Westminster. The lantern carried by Fawkes survived. It passed from the family of one of the men present at the arrest to the University of Oxford in 1641. In 1887, it moved from the Bodleian Library to the Ashmolean Museum, where it sits today in a glass case in the gallery called Arc to Ashmolean. It is catalogued as AN 1887.2. Iron and horn, 34.5 centimetres tall. The rotating cylinder still works. No one turns it. And every year, before the state opening of Parliament, the Yeomen of the Guard, the King's personal bodyguard, in service since 1485, descend into the basements of the Palace of Westminster in their Tudor scarlet, carrying ceremonial halberds and ceremonial lanterns, and search for explosives. They have done this every year, without interruption, for 420 years. They will do it again this November. In Oxford, the lantern is in light now. The cellar is gone. The men who waited in the dark with a flame 2 inches from their fingers are gone. The chamber they meant to destroy has been rebuilt, and a different generation of men sit in it. But the rotating cylinder of sheet iron, the instrument made to keep light invisible, sits behind glass illuminated, photographed by visitors who walk past it without stopping. They shall receive a terrible blow this Parliament. The phrase has not stopped being true. The blow is no longer falling where they aimed it. They struck at Parliament to end it. Parliament made the strike its liturgy, and survives by remembering them.